did we see on the radar that his altitude was decreasing as he got closer to the rising terrain? Was he envisioning that the cloud layer was getting a little bit lower and he was getting squeezed?
I think getting squeezed is a good description. We can see as they're heading westbound from the Van Nuys area and along somewhat flatter terrain, they maintain the 500 feet above ground level pretty well. The terrain starts to rise, the helicopter starts to climb, but after a certain point, he's not climbing anymore to maintain that 500 feet, and it starts to slowly tick down until we get to about that 350 that I mentioned, about where that construction site camera saw him.
So it would be reasonable to assume, I know that's a dangerous term, but it would be reasonable to assume that he had a sense, this isn't working as well as we would have hoped, and I'm having to kind of work at this to stay visual, and yet I'm losing terrain clearance. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's consistent with the data that we have, including his call to ATC and everything as well. That's all consistent.
Right. The chairman also talked about go versus no go. And there's only one time, I think, that you can make that, and that is prior to departure. Because once you've decided to go, now you've moved into a different decision-making realm. And so now it's constantly, you're having to assess, in this case, a mile or a mile and a half at a time, whether continuing is the right thing to do or whether we should be looking at some alternative. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. That's entirely appropriate. It's actually discussed in ADM literature and training as well.
So moving from this, and again, Member Graham, I think, had talked a little bit. I'm a big proponent of simulation as opposed to going into the aircraft, but particularly when you're trying to do spatial disorientation, we don't get the full sense of vestibular disturbances without having some external motion in the process. And motion visual simulators are pretty good at that, but they're still not the aircraft itself. And having done a lot of training, both simulated and in simulators, both, where do we stand in terms of better in-cockpit simulations, such as a virtual reality helmet or something like that? Maybe Mr. or Dr. Civilian could talk a little about that.
Yes, the United States Helicopter Safety Team is aware of technology, virtual reality technology used for helmets that can assist pilots with recognition and recovery methods. And so that technology is in the process of being developed.
So, and I guess I'm less concerned so much about the transitional aspect. That's nice, that's icing on the cake, but it would really be nice if we could just get really good IMC duplication exterior to the aircraft and not be able to use that one peak being worth 1,000 cross checks. My time is up, so I'll stop here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman, thank you very much. And we'll now go to Member Homendy.
Thank you very much. Dr. Civilian, I do want to talk about SMS and the risk assessment form that Island Express used. But first, there are probably a lot of people watching thinking, well, this was a pilot issue. Why look at all the other issues with the operator? Why recommend SMS? Why look at a risk assessment form? Why look at cockpit voice recorders, flight data monitoring? Why do we go broader?
Because we want to ensure that we have an effective overall investigation and that we are looking into the details in all aspects. Like you noted, safety management systems involves the company, and we do look at company organizational factors.
Thank you. And with that, you mentioned 4 areas of safety management systems: safety policy, safety assurance, risk management, safety promotion, which were in the company's materials. Was it carried out that way?
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, and so typically you would have a top-down approach to safety management systems. That's what we often talk about. And while the director of operations was the account executive or on record, it is the president's role to really drive that home. And do you believe the president was really involved with SMS?
The evidence suggests from the interviews that we conducted that the president was aware of, but not involved in the company SMS.
And should be, though.
Absolutely, because it starts at the top of the organization.
Yeah, in fact, he said, my role is president, so at the end of the day, it all stops with me. But then he says, I'm not in the day-to-day operation at Island. And then when asked about SMS, he said, I wouldn't say I'm involved with safety management systems. I'm aware of it and how it's structured. And so it was clear to me throughout every single one of the interviews that the pilots, the director of operations, the director of safety, even the president thought their SMS program was essentially a risk assessment form, a tool that they had essentially contracted with outside vendor. Is that correct?
Yes, they did not ensure that a specific area safety assurance was integrated effectively into their SMS.
Yeah, so essentially all they talked about was this risk management, this risk assessment form. We have a copy of the form in the docket, and I looked at the form and completed it myself as if I was at that point at 9:45 on that pilot. And I checked off cloud ceiling, less than 2,000. Even if it was 1,000, you wouldn't get that many more points. I checked off special visual flight rules, 8 points. I even checked off light rain, which there was missed, but I gave him that. Visibility under 3 statute miles, familiar with the airport. Higher than 2,000 hours, estimated flight time 3 to 4 hours. Even added internal stress, self-induced stress. After I completed all of that and added it up, I came up with 37. What is their, how do they operate on these scores? There's a 45 and a 60. What do those scores mean to the company?
Yes, 45 would mean that the overall risk assessment is elevated. And 60 would mean that that would be a high risk, and they would have to seek management approval for mitigation.
So I got a 37, and that's really checking everything. So did anybody ever report getting to 60?
No.
Is that a problem? Do you see that as essential? That's a little bit part of the problem. The overall problem is actually the SMS program.
The SMS program, the SMS was the area that we identified, in particular, the safety assurance component, where we saw the issues.
And I don't have much time, but Member Graham asked about this. There is a voluntary program. Why do we recommend that it be mandatory? And how many people how many operators actually participate in the voluntary program versus how many are out there?
The benefit of the FAA Safety Management System voluntary program is that the FAA FSDO, Flight Standards District Office, can help work with the operator to set up their safety management system. And because the FAA has experience with developing SMS, that can aid the operator in understanding what's required. Currently, there are 17 operators, 135 operators that are in the process of or have been approved for the voluntary program, and another 158 that are in some sort of the process with the FAA of getting approval. So if you take the over, let's say, 1,900 operators, that's how that data is broken down.
So very few out of total operators are actually approved through the voluntary program to have SMS.
Yes.
So thank you very much. I'm out of time, and I will come back to this. Thank you for the additional time to allow him to answer my question.
Absolutely, and thank you for your questions. Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up right where Member Hamady left off, because I'm looking at that flight risk assessment form also, and I've worked with these in my prior flight operations, and I'm not a big fan of just numbered ones, because there may be a hazard out there that requires you to mitigate that risk, you know, even though you don't get a 45 or 60 that would require some other kind of action. And if this pilot would have updated his flight risk assessment form when he was checking the weather at John Wayne Airport in Santa Ana, a couple things that jump out at me. He would have noticed the ceiling was lower than what was forecast that he originally looked at earlier in the morning. So he probably would have checked off two things. One would have been special VFR en route, which there's a caution there on the flight risk assessment form. It says write your plan B in the header comments. So he would have required a header, a plan, an alternate plan. And then the other one was ceiling less than 500 feet. Must call director of operations or chief pilot, which was him, but he should have called the director of ops and assess the weather and make a safety decision, which I would assume he would have talked about plan B. So in that case, that didn't happen, and it was unfortunate. So I'd like to jump back to where the vice chairman was talking about the pinch. And so Mr. English, you might want to come on up for this. As the pilot intercepted the 101 again and started heading up through the valley there, what was his airspeed? Had he changed his airspeed from what he was originally at?
No, sir. The airspeed was about 140 knots.
140 knots, yeah. Okay. And in accordance with the FAA guidance and the training he had received from the Euro safety instructors, he was kind of getting pinched below, maybe a little bit of lowering of the weather, and the terrain was coming up. I think we probably see data that he was very aware of that. What was he trained to do at that point?
It's very clear that slowing down is
slowing down.
Is part of this.
Yet he kept going at 140. Would it be uncommon for a pilot at that point, when he most likely entered the weather, we believe, and decided to climb, would it be uncommon for a pilot to trade that airspeed for altitude?
That's not consistent with the training, but
Correct.
That is what we look like. It looks like what he did.
Yeah. As a fixed wing pilot, that's what I would have done, but I wouldn't have been down there as a fixed wing pilot, most likely. So exactly, he didn't follow the training there. And a matter of fact, his POI, you know, what did he tell the pilots about avoiding adverse weather? Do you know offhand?
Mr. Salazar is very
Okay.
conversant in the training.
Okay.
Would you repeat the question, sir?
Yeah. So what was he trained to do from the POI, or what did the POI advise him during his flights with him?
The POI would start with the on oral evaluation and seek information for an understanding that the pilot would avoid the instrument conditions. And then when he got into the aircraft, he would be required to perform maneuvers, unusual attitudes, and recovering from inadvertent entry into instrument meteorological conditions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the quotes out of there in the interviews, he said, you know, pilot, to avoid adverse weather, he should divert, return to base, or land the helicopter.
Yes, sir.
From the POI. And unfortunately, the pilot didn't do that in this case. So as my time's running out here, I think I would just like to echo what the chairman has said. And if I was looking to charter an aircraft for, you know, to take passengers somewhere, or if I actually coordinated that for individuals to take a flight, I think I would really, in lieu of anything else that might come along from the FAA as far as regulation or anything, which obviously usually takes years to institute, I would hope that those chartering helicopters for passenger flights would look at IFR operators that have current and certified instrument pilots and are certified for IFR flight operations to transport my passengers. So with that, I see my time is up, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Member Graham, thank you very much. And Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question about an alternative plan. In draft finding number 7, which we'll look at in just a little bit, draft finding number 7 identifies 3 factors that apparently contributed to the pilot's decision to continue the flight, including lack of an alternative plan. However, lack of an alternative plan is not included or referenced as a contributing factor in the draft probable cause. Why is that? And should we consider referencing lack of an alternative plan as a contributing factor in the probable cause?
Member Chapman, perhaps I can expand on that a little bit. We may be thinking of alternative plan in the alternate airport rules or something like that from instrument flying, and that's not exactly what the main risk of that is here. The alternative plan keys into the self-induced pressure and the other biases that that we've been looking at, in that the company didn't really have a robust infrastructure to help out in case the pilot did have to go to a plan B, whatever that might be. Divert, for example, divert to Van Nuys. In fact, that was a relatively easy plan B. Divert to Van Nuys, if they waited 20 or 30 minutes there, the clouds would have lifted and easy to go through, or divert and get ground transportation. It wasn't very easy for him to say, this is something that we can do and it's not going to be a big deal. We think that is part and parcel of where we're talking about the company and their assurance and their oversight and being able to have some of these, not necessarily aviation alternates, but alternates that help take the pressure off the pilot.
Thank you, Mr. English. That's helpful. For actually, this will be my last question, Mr. Chairman, and it's not really a question. I want to return to the topic of voluntary safety management systems, and I want to reiterate the numbers that we just heard a few minutes ago. This is information that our investigative team obtained from the FAA. So FAA is aware of these numbers. There are 1,940 Part 135 certificate holders. Of those, only 17, as we just heard, only 17 have an FAA accepted voluntary safety management system. There are another 158 operators whose safety management systems are in various stages of development, and they've applied for FAA acceptance under the voluntary program, but they have a ways to go. So the level of participation on a voluntary basis among Part 135 operators is thin. It's laudable that some have taken the steps necessary to secure FAA acceptance under the voluntary program, but the numbers suggest there is a lot of work to be done. I hope FAA will eventually step up here. In the meantime, I encourage the various industry organizations and major operators which support voluntary adoption of safety management systems to maintain their efforts. My thanks to everybody today for the patience and good work during the meeting.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. Mr. Salazar, I want to return to a question that I was asking before the break. I got a little pinched on time there. As a very experienced helicopter pilot, can you tell me how having a second pilot might have helped in this situation?
Well, you have the ability to converse with the other pilot and share your thoughts on an upcoming decision. And if you make a decision that is questionable, the other pilot would be able to bring up concerns.
Thank you very much. So my question is, and I don't think there's an answer for this, it's curious that one of the clients for Island Express required 2 pilots, but not for all clients. I realize there's a difference between, I mean, this helicopter was certainly certified for single pilot operations, but there's a difference between legal and safe. And it's just curious to me why Island Express was not utilizing this helicopter in a 2 pilot configuration. Any thoughts on that? I don't think we know the answer. I saw nothing about that. Any thoughts?
I agree with you, sir. That's a hard question to answer.
Well, let me ask you this. How can a potential customer be assured or have the greatest knowledge about what he or she is getting? I mean, we've mentioned a couple of things today that maybe, and Michael Graham, Member Graham, thank you for supporting this idea that it's good. It would probably be preferable to have an IFR capable charter operator. I've been trying to go along the line of questionings that two pilots might have been more be a better operation. So how can the consumer be discriminating in terms of making sure that he or she is getting the absolute highest levels of safety?
Sir, that's something that we've been discussing with charters for many years. I go way back to the famous Platinum Jet accident, which we discussed this with Part 135. And we want to make it certain here that we are not in any way concluding in this investigation that Island Express was not a safe operator. This operation that they conducted, this flight, was entirely legal and is actually the norm for Part 135 passenger carrying helicopter operations. The vast majority of helicopter passengers operations are VFR and can be conducted completely safely. I think if the FAA didn't believe that, there would certainly not be so many of them. Can be conducted perfectly safely when conducted within the parameters of the regulations and their operation specifications. We're looking at a flight here that pressed on into the clouds, and we don't see any specific factors in this accident that directly relate to single pilot versus dual pilot. For example, workload, as Dr. Civilian mentioned. It doesn't take much workload to turn the helicopter around and land it at Van Nuys. It takes a good decision and a good support to do that. Now, having said that, the FAA does actually aid passengers in looking for the truly unsafe, those rogue operators. The FAA's Safe Air Charter program is available, and people can look for those who are really operating the fly-by-night type of operation. But I want to make it clear that that is not the type of operator that we believe Island Express is.
Thank you. We did find some deficiencies in their operations, in the Island Express operations. What can you enumerate some of those?
Yes, sir. In fact, we've already discussed some of the things here in that they were not incorporating the SMS. We don't feel that's not a rogue type of thing. They just didn't know any better. That's what we have here. Is the deficiencies that they had was through ignorance in the true sense of the word. They just didn't know how to incorporate those components of SMS and safety program.
Great, thank you very much. Certainly, I've got more questions, and we'll catch those in the next round. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I want to follow up a bit more on the SMS situation. We've had a recommendation for voluntary SMS as well as mandatory for some time. Mr. English, could you discuss the concept of scalability? Because I think some of the challenges that some of the operators have is that it has to be this huge, very complicated type of system. So talk about scalability, if you would, sir.
Yes, I can. And you're exactly right. SMS is not necessarily an enormous type of program. It can be scaled to even the smallest mom and pop operation using the appropriate components. Dr. Civilian, I know, is prepared to get deeply into that for you.
Yes. In terms of the SMS, the FAA has provided information to operators, whether you have a small organization, medium or large. In this case, Island Express could be considered a small organization. However, the 4 components of SMS still apply, as we discussed earlier, which means that they should be understanding that they need to implement those components of SMS within Island Express.
So it would be different, though, say, for the small operator, Island Express, say, versus petroleum helicopters, which is a much larger type of operation. The concept is the same, but the actual implementation would be appropriate for their level of operation. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct. And the guidance that the FAA has provided helps organizations integrate their safety management processes with the unique business models.
The other area I want to talk about, and we've had some recommendations out about flight data monitoring, which in today's technology is not tremendously complicated. As humans, we behave differently when we're being watched. A former president once said, trust but verify. And you only need to put a policeman on the side of the road or have a speed camera that people know about, and you see behavior is changed considerably. I think with the flight data monitoring, if organizations are using it, it changes the behavior. I mean, this is how the airlines work. Do you have any thoughts on that concept and how it affects people if an organization does, in fact, periodically audit whether crews are actually doing what they say they're going to be doing according to their operation specifications?
Yes, sir. In fact, we have reiterated a flight data monitoring recommendation along with this report, or proposed reiteration. And that's exactly right. Flight data monitoring is more than just a gadget. It's the program associated with that, and using that aggregate data to feed back in and make sure that, as you say, people are operating within their specified parameters.
Yeah, I find in terms of the training environment or the checking environment, everybody is on their best behavior. And I think we saw that here, that the FAA's principal operation inspector said that the crash pilot here was, doing an exemplary job because he was behaving differently. And as we get into our findings, I think we find out that in the real world, when he knows that he's pretty much on his own and there isn't an inspector sitting next to him, it's a different environment. Mr. Chairman, I don't think I have any further questions at this point. I want to thank everybody for their efforts and look forward to our further deliberations.
Vice Chairman, thank you very much. Member Hamady.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask about cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders. We have some recommendations on those. Whoever, Mr. English or someone else can pop up for those. Was there a CVR on the helicopter when it was manufactured?
Yes, ma'am. It was delivered with a CVR.
And when Island Express purchased the helicopter in 2015, they made some modifications to the helicopter, which also involved removing the CVR.
That's correct.
And under current regulations, what operations right now in aviation require cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders?
This particular flight, the VFR, the single pilot operation, did not require a CVR. The regulations are quite complicated, so I will defer to Mr. Babcock from our recorders lab, who can explain that to you.
Thank you.
Good morning. For cockpit voice recorders, the general rule is 2 engines and 2 pilots and 6 passenger seats or more. For flight data recorders, it gets vastly more complicated, taking into account the data manufacturer, the helicopter, and the number of passenger seats. For this particular helicopter, it was manufactured before any flight data recorder requirements would have applied for the number of seats it had.
What's the safety advantage? Because we get people on the outside say you only want CVRs or FDRs to conduct investigations, to help you in your investigations. What's the response to that? How does it improve? How do they improve safety?
Well, ma'am, we like to believe that our investigations do improve safety, first of all. And CVRs and FDRs are primarily intended for investigative purposes. However, similar devices, and such as Vice Chairman Landsberg was mentioning, can also be used within a flight data monitoring program, non-punitive type programs, to detect various precursors to accidents.
In the report, we mentioned a particular helicopter crash where there were benefits to having a CVR and an FDR on the helicopter. Can you talk about that?
Yes, ma'am. Obviously, we like to have properly recorded operating recorders to benefit our investigative ability. In this particular case, having recorders of some type or another might have helped us clarify some of the items that we've had to infer from other data. For example, if there were any alerts going off in the cockpit, if the pilot was actually saying anything to the passengers, if there was video, we might be able to see more details about the weather or where exactly his eyes were looking. Flight data recording or some other type of electronic recording might be able to clarify exactly how he was working the autopilot, for example.
Well, in this one in particular, because of what we were able to gather from those devices, we actually issued 3 urgent safety recommendations on airworthiness issues. If it weren't for the recorders, we wouldn't have had the information, and that's where it is key for they're key for improving safety. In fact, we've seen other areas and other modes where cameras or recorders are critical for safety purposes, not just for our investigations. I'll take a recent rail example where we looked at a train crash in DuPont, Washington, and if it wasn't for the camera recording inside the cab, we wouldn't have known that the locomotive engineer wasn't trained properly and really looked into the training deficiencies of Amtrak. Why is it important to have crash resistant recorders, and are they also fire resistant?
The crash resistant recorders are and fire resistance to some effect are important in the case of the accident, of course. Surviving, especially something like this, would be important for us. For flight data monitoring, it's not necessary.
Okay, and I'm actually going to come back to this on a couple of other things, but my time is run out. I will, with my 23 seconds, mention one thing on SMS just to close that out, which was the last communication we received from FAA on SMS for Part 135 indicated they were having difficulty because of 2 executive orders. On 2-for-1, you have to eliminate 2 regulations for each new regulation you implement, and those have been rescinded by the Biden administration. So I'll look forward to FAA's renewed efforts on SMS for Part 135. Thank you.
Member Hominy, thank you very much. And Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to stay with the flight data monitoring devices and programs. To put it simply, flight data, for those that are listening and not sure what flight data monitoring devices do, they help identify and correct deviations before an accident occurs. So it allows the operation to look and see if there's been deviations from maybe an aircraft limitation or an operational limitation that has been put in their operating manual, and allows them to see that and then go correct it in a non-punitive way, is the way the program monitoring programs are done. And if you eliminate those near misses or those minor hazards out there, then hopefully you eliminate the risk of the major accident that could result by not looking at these trends and mitigating the risk. In 2014, when the FAA required flight data monitoring devices for air ambulance operators, they stopped short of requiring a flight data monitoring program. So my question is, what is the benefit of a flight data or a flight monitoring device without implementing a flight data monitoring program?
We think the two are required to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. What was the FAA's reasoning for not requiring a FDM program in this case?
I think Mr. Hoyt can speak to the recommendation response.
The FAA basically told us that it has guidance available for operators to implement flight data monitoring programs if they choose to do so, but it decided not to actually require the program.
Yeah, and I think part of that is the they thought, did they think that they were going to have to get involved with their flight data monitoring program, like a FOQA program, a flight operational quality assurance program that like the airlines have?
Correct. Yeah, and they basically said that in order to protect for the information to stay protected, it needs to be voluntarily submitted and participation in a voluntary program such as FOQA.
Absolutely. So I think they just kind of want to not have to figure out the resources, as in human resources, to be part of that program, which is unfortunate. So I did notice that the FAA administrator in October, speaking to a group, actually talked about flight data monitoring, and I quote here from him: "Part and parcel of SMS are the practices of flight data monitoring and safety reporting. These are proactive, data-driven approaches to oversight that prioritize safety above all else." So I really appreciate the administrator's support of flight data monitoring, and I really look forward to working with him and the FAA to prevent and save lives by working with flight data monitoring programs. And with that, that's all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Graham. Mr. English, I want to come back to something that was said before the break. I'm sorry, in my last line of questioning. You had indicated that, I think you said that Island Express was a safe operation. Is that, am I paraphrasing that correctly?
I would say there wouldn't be any indication that Island Express was uniquely unsafe or a problem operator.
Which company had this crash, Mr. English?
Well, Island Express, of course.
So I'm seeing a disconnect here. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, this company had a crash, and you're saying there's nothing to indicate that they were not safe.
Well, you asked, I think the concept of that questioning was how a consumer could, detect an unsafe operator, and there was nothing inherent about this operator that would indicate they were unsafe. I mean, I think we see crashes with other carriers and don't particularly indicate that they are unsafe, but they've had a gap, they've had a flaw, perhaps they didn't know any better, but that doesn't necessarily make them a problem operator. They just need to do some things differently or know something differently.
Thank you. In fact, by most measures, the interviews that we conducted, the pilot was well thought of, well regarded. He was the chief pilot, had good credentials, and I think this illustrates that even good pilots can end up in bad situations. And I know that I flew for 32 years, and there's certainly several occasions along the way that I made bad decisions and exercised poor judgment. And I think that's a lesson right there, is that we all are subjected to, the term I was told years ago was sludge, SLOJ, sudden loss of judgment. And here's a case where a pilot who's well regarded apparently got into a very bad situation. So let me see if I understand this. So is basically the scenario that we believe happened is that he's flying along, he realizes that he's sort of getting boxed in with visibility, and then he must have made the decision, you know what, I'm just going to punch up through these clouds and get on top. Is that basically the scenario that we believe happened?
I think that's correct, and I heartily agree with your statement that this is good people can make a bad decision, and we really want to get to the bottom of why.
Yeah, thank you very much. So therefore, we need redundancy in the system so that when somebody does make a bad mistake or commit an error, there's enough redundancy in the system to be able to trap those errors before they become consequential. And so one of the things I want to know is that what can the helicopter industry do to help pilots who end up in inadvertent IMC? I flew an Airbus Airbus airplane for many years. It had flight envelope protections. It would not let me take the airplane outside of a safe envelope. Has there been any consideration to something like that for helicopters? I think back to general aviation, I believe there's one or perhaps more avionics manufacturers that somebody can press a button and it will right the airplane. So are there any thoughts about that for the helicopter industry that you're aware of?
Sir, that technology does exist for helicopters. There is a major avionics manufacturer that makes an autopilot with electronic stability protection and the level button that you described. Not sure if it would apply to this. This is kind of a legacy aircraft, but that technology does exist. It's coming down in price. The technology is advancing, so it does exist out there in the industry now, and it's getting into lower and lower costs.
Thank you very much. I always read the party submissions, and Island Express offered a party submission whereby they made a number of statements about how the controllers did or did not perform properly. Frankly, in reading through the case, I didn't see any issues. In fact, I saw some things that were wrong in the Island Express submission. But basically, they talk about the controller's multiple errors, the alleged failure to properly communicate termination of radar flight following, the incomplete position relief briefing between the two pilots, the lack of knowledge of the current weather conditions, which monopolized the accident pilot's attention during a critical phase of flight, and by causing him to make multiple radio calls. So here's my question. Did any of the air traffic control actions, errors, or omissions contribute in any way to this horrible tragedy?
No, sir.
Thank you very much. Vice Chairman Landsberg, questions for you, sir. Thank you, Mr. English.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Hamady.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to get back to flight data monitoring for a second, and I just wanted to highlight something that the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team Working Group said, which was data recording devices enable proactive intervention before an event occurs based on some of the fatal accidents in a data set they looked at. The U.S. Helicopter Safety Team Working Group thought flight data monitoring systems could have made a difference. Hazardous behavior could have been identified with the opportunity to break the accident chain before it resulted in a fatality. Now, we have recommended flight data monitoring for 12 years. We've recommended SMS for 12 years in one form or another, starting with HEMS. And we've recommended recorders going back 22 years. On flight data monitoring, the FAA responded at one point to our recommendations pretty, I thought, somewhat aggressively in 2017, stating the FAA will not initiate rulemaking that mandates operators to establish flight data monitoring programs. And at the time, they said it was because the cost-benefit analysis did not show any benefits. In fact, does anyone want to guess what they showed as the costs to the industry over 10 years and what the benefits were? My guess is Mr. Hoyt knows the answer to that question. I can't hear you.
Sorry, the cost that the FAA estimated for FDMs was at $20.6 million, and the benefit was $0.
Zero benefits, they said. Now, I want to look at that for a second, because at the time we had showed them our data from 2000 to 2015, where we investigated 7 accidents where flight data monitoring program could have prevented. Those 7 accidents killed 53 people and injured another 4. So if I add to that, after 2015, Togiak, Alaska, where 3 were killed, 2 killed in Teterboro, 3 in Zaleski, and 9 here in this crash, all of which we advocated for flight data monitoring. The DOT, Mr. Hoyt, do you know how much the price tag DOT puts for a life?
Yes, I believe it's at 9.6 million per fatality.
9.6 million for a fatality. For an injury, for serious injuries, it's 987,000. So if you look at 67 people killed, which we identified, and 4 injured, you come up with 676 million, and with a cost over 20 years then of roughly $42 million. So seems to me that the benefit from lives saved alone, using what I think is a very flawed, broken cost-benefit analysis that I hope the current administration revisits, seems to greatly exceed what FAA estimated the costs to be. And so with that, we continue, and this board meeting is just the first of what I believe is a long series of the NTSB advocating for our recommendations to be implemented. And I will have one more question on how we do that, but I'm coming up on some running out of time, so I will go ahead and yield back my 46 seconds.
Thank you very much. I don't believe any of my colleagues have any additional questions in addition to myself. Do any of my colleagues have any questions before we go back to Member Hamady? Okay, seeing none, Member Hamady, you are recognized.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize one more time that for the NTSB, this is just really, at least for the board members, really the first step in our process of improving safety. After a board meeting, safety isn't improved until we get our recommendations implemented. And so we work hard after this board meeting to do that. And we have a great team at the NTSB to accomplish that. And what I want to do is recognize Ms. Hatchett, who runs our safety recommendation and communications Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications, to talk about what we do after the board meeting to get our recommendations implemented.
Thank you, Member Hamady, and I appreciate the opportunity to address this. I think it's really important that we unpack that for those that are viewing the board meeting today. The agency investigates accidents, including the Sikorsky crash, to determine what went wrong and issue safety recommendations to prevent future accidents and save lives. But as you know, the recommendations don't do any good unless they're acted on. So after the board meeting ends, our work continues. In my office, the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications, we track and evaluate responses to the board's recommendations, and we work with all of you to advocate for their adoption. For those viewing the board meeting, I want to unpack that. So let me explain how all this works. Our safety recommendations team records and tracks all responses to recommendations that we issue. The organization that receives the recommendations, such as the FAA, writes to the NTSB to describe what they plan to do and what actions they plan to take in order to address the recommendations. The team evaluates the response and determines whether the action taken will satisfy the recommendation or is likely to once the action is completed. A letter is prepared and it's approved by the board describing our evaluation of the response, and a classification of the recommendation is made. The team also contacts recipients because we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence for those who have not responded to a recommendation for some time to ensure that progress is being made in that regard. Our government affairs teams, they are actively engaged with Congress, governors, state legislatures about our investigations and recommendations, and monitors federal and state legislative efforts to improve safety. We will provide requested information to congressional staff about our open recommendations, including those discussed in today's meeting, such as recorders. As you know, we regularly update Congress regarding the status of recommendations as they conduct oversight and consider legislation. We facilitate board member and NTSB staff appearances to keep open safety recommendations in the forefront of public discussion. And I know that we have worked with the Air Charter Foundation and advocated on behalf of SMS. I believe last year the chairman spoke at the training center in that regard. And also we had a roundtable, I think it was a day after the Sikorsky helicopter incident, the crash with the helicopter foundation. I'm sorry, the Helicopter Air Charter Safety Foundation. So we are actively engaged there. So we continue to work with the board and look for those opportunities to keep the pressure on those who receive our recommendation. Our advocacy team, and I know that member Chapman mentioned this, he mentioned the most wanted list. So the most wanted list is the premier advocacy tool by which we identify the top safety improvements that can be made to prevent accidents, minimize injuries, and save lives in the future. The issues that are under discussion today, specifically recorders, flight data monitoring, safety management systems, and as well as you know, they're not new. They're not new to the agency. They are such important topics. I believe the chairman mentioned this in his opening remarks, and others have mentioned it as well, that it is on our current most wanted list under Improve the Safety Part 135 Aircraft Flight Operations. So we have a whole effort, a comprehensive approach that, you know, when the gavel goes down and the board meeting concludes, it truly at that point is the beginning, not the end of a critical aspect of our work. So I appreciate you providing the time so those that are viewing this understand how important what we do is, and that we really continue our efforts long after the board meeting concludes.
Oh, I was on mute. I was telling you thank you. That's how it goes in the virtual environment. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're quite welcome. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from my colleagues on the board? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Curtis, if you'd please read the proposed findings.
Certainly, Chairman. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 13 findings. Number 1, none of the following safety issues were identified for the accident flight. 1, pilot qualification deficiencies or impairment due to medical condition, alcohol, other drugs, or fatigue. 2, helicopter malfunction or failure. Or 3, pressure on the pilot from Island Express Helicopters, Inc., the air charter broker, or the client to complete the flight. Number 2, although the air traffic controller's failure to report the loss of radar contact and radar communication with the accident flight was inconsistent with air traffic control procedures, this deficiency did not contribute to the accident or affect its survivability. Number 3, had the pilot completed an updated flight risk analysis form for the accident flight that considered the weather information available at the time the flight departed, the flight would have remained within the company's low risk category, but would have required the pilot to seek input from the director of operations and to provide an alternative plan. Number 4, at the time the pilot took action to initiate a climb, the helicopter had already begun penetrating clouds, and the pilot lost visual reference to the horizon and the ground. The loss of outside visual reference was possibly intermittent at first, but likely complete by the time the flight began to enter the left turn that diverged from its route over US Route 101. Number 5, the pilot's poor decision to fly at an excessive airspeed for the weather conditions was inconsistent with his adverse weather avoidance training and reduced the time available for him to choose an alternative course of action to avoid entering instrument meteorological conditions. Number 6, The pilot experienced spatial disorientation while climbing the helicopter in instrument meteorological conditions, which led to his loss of helicopter control and the resulting collision with terrain. Number 7, the pilot's decision to continue the flight into deteriorating weather conditions was likely influenced by his self-induced pressure to fulfill the client's travel needs, his lack of an alternative plan, and his planned continuation bias, which strengthened as the flight neared the destination. Number 8, Island Express Helicopters, Inc.'s lack of a documented policy and safety assurance evaluations to ensure that its pilots were consistently and correctly completing the flight risk analysis forms hindered the effectiveness of the form as a risk management tool. Number 9, a fully implemented mandatory safety management system could enhance Island Express Helicopter Inc.'s ability to manage risks. Number 10, the use of appropriate simulation devices in scenario-based helicopter pilot training has the potential to improve pilots' abilities to accurately assess weather and make appropriate weather-related decisions. Number 11, objective research to evaluate spatial disorientation simulation technologies may help determine which applications are most effective for training pilots to recognize the onset of spatial disorientation and successfully mitigate it. Number 12, a pilot data monitoring program which can enable an operator to identify and mitigate factors that may influence deviations from established norms and procedures can be particularly beneficial for operators like Island Express Helicopters, Inc. that conduct single pilot operations and have little opportunity to directly observe their pilots in the operational environment. And number 13, a crash-resistant flight recorder system that records parametric data and cockpit audio and images with a view of the cockpit environment to include as much of the outside view as possible could have provided valuable information about the visual cues associated with the adverse weather and the pilot's focus of attention in the cockpit following the flight's entry into instrument meteorological conditions.
Mr. Curtis, thank you very much for reading those proposed findings. At this time, we'll do a roll call of the board to ensure that we are prepared to deliberate. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I'm ready to deliberate, sir.
Thank you, sir. Member Hamady.
I'm ready to deliberate as well.
Thank you. Member Graham.
Member Graham's ready to deliberate.
Great, thank you. Let me pin you up here. And Member Chapman.
I'm present, Mr. Chairman, and ready for deliberations.
Thank you very much. I believe we have a proposed amendment. Member Chapman, are you planning to offer a proposed amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a proposed amendment to.
Okay. All right, that's good. Let me just see. Does anybody else have any others? Okay, great. Member Chapman, you are recognized, sir. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. I have a proposed amendment to finding number 7, and this is in conjunction with further discussion that we will likely have as we proceed to discussion of the probable cause, the draft probable cause. This has to do with my concern about
Member Chapman, if you'd please make your motion and see if we get a second, then you can discuss it.
Certainly. I move that we amend finding number 7 as follows. The pilot's decision to continue the flight into deteriorating weather conditions was strike likely, influenced by his insert possible self-induced pressure to fulfill the client's travel needs, his lack of an alternative plan, and his planned continuation bias, which strengthened as the flight neared the destination. And I circulated this language. It's the same language that you all saw yesterday afternoon.
Thank you very much. You've heard Member Chapman's motion. Is there a second?
Second for discussion.
Okay, Member Hamady has seconded it for discussion, and Member Chapman, you are recognized for discussion.
Yes, sir. As I indicated, this relates to my concern about identifying self-induced pressure definitively, at least, as a contributing factor in the probable cause. As I've said earlier during the question and answer, it certainly could be that self-induced pressure played a role, and it's reasonable to discuss it as a possibility, but there's little objective evidence on which to base the finding that it actually contributed to the pilot's decision-making, other than the fact that there was a relationship between the pilot and the client. And I know we all agree that we should avoid determining contributing factors based on speculation. That's my concern, is that we need to avoid, in crafting this, we need to avoid being too speculative about the extent to which self-induced pressure played a role, and that self-induced pressure resulted from the relationship with the client.
Okay, so thank you. As it relates to the finding, you're proposing to change, strike the word likely and add the word possible. So any discussion? Please open it up. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Yeah, I'm conflicted on this because I certainly understand Member Chapman's concern about us not going into speculative areas. But I think when we get into the human factors aspect, as Dr. Civilian has discussed and Mr. English, I see, to use the legal term, the preponderance of the evidence, if you will, and we're pretty clear that there was no alternative plan. The pilot had multiple opportunities to change. We saw him deliberately descending as he was getting pinched, as I think is the technical term, between the ground and the clouds. We also know that, at least I know from personal experience, and maybe some of my fellow pilots will agree, that the closer you get to the destination, the more you think that maybe, just maybe, you can pull this off. The other point is he didn't follow any of the recommended mitigations for entering instrument meteorological conditions, or to properly, once he had entered them, configure the aircraft by slowing down, by starting a climb, by activating the autopilot. None of that happened. And this is unfortunately not the first time we've seen this kind of behavior. I will cite several crashes that go before. Buddy Holly and Patsy Cline, to go back a very long way, and then just to show you that I'm not totally clueless on culture, more recently the Aaliyah crash in the Bahamas, and Stevie Ray Vaughan, which was another helicopter crash involving instrument meteorological conditions. And in all of those cases, you're dealing with someone of great star power status and pilots who desperately want to do a good job for the customer. So my sense is that the preponderance of the evidence, let's call it 51%, indicate that this pilot really wanted to get where he was going. So thank you for the opportunity to express my views.
Thank you, Member Hamady.
Thank you. And just for clarification, Member Chapman, your amendment is really modifying self-induced pressure. It's maintaining as is the reference to lack of an alternative plan and plan continuation bias, correct?
That's my intention, yes.
Yeah. So, on this issue, I was equally conflicted. I looked at FAA guidance on aeronautical decision-making and human psychology, and it very clearly states there are tendencies or operational pitfalls that come with the development of pilot experience. These are classic behavioral traps into which pilots have been known to fall. More experienced pilots, as a rule, try to complete a flight as planned, please passengers, and meet schedules. And so, but with that, where I was a little bit concerned is I didn't see evidence of any of that in the docket. And I understand I am not a pilot. But you know, there were actually comments more about him being willing to cancel flights for weather, and also in response to pressure from OC helicopters. In fact, I think the statement was from one individual. He had no problem canceling flights. He had told OC helicopters on several occasions that, and OC helicopters would get upset if he canceled a flight, and he responded by sending them a screenshot of the weather and would not be pressured into flying. So, I mean, I know that's a different issue, but there was more evidence to the contrary of self-induced pressure in the docket itself.
Okay, thank you. Member Graham, do you have any comments?
At this time, no. I think I have more or less a question for the investigative team on this when we get to that.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, all we're talking about here is this finding. I think the discussions thus far have sort of been teed up for the probable cause. So let's focus on the finding here. We're talking about changing the word likely and later inserting the word possible. So I'll tell you where I stand. I could support Member Chapman's finding amendment. I do not plan to support at this time. Now I'll wait and hear the discussion, but I do not plan to support an amendment on the probable cause, but we haven't gotten there yet. So with that, staff, what would be your feeling if we were to adopt the amendment to finding number 7?
Mr. Chairman, I think I could take that first, or perhaps Ms. Schultz can chime in. But I think staff is quite convinced that likely is the most appropriate word here. I think it's important to note that the use of self-induced pressure here is not an individual flaw identified in this pilot. This is something that the analysis is identified as a trait of any pilot, of any human being, and it's important to note that is solidly supported by the preponderance of evidence, as the Vice Chairman mentioned, in the literature. So we do believe that as solid a conclusion as the spatial disorientation, whereas possible just leaves it open to being very weak in our conclusion, and we are quite convinced that self-induced pressure is actually the factor here. I think Director Schultz may have something to add, or Dr. Civilian.
Thank you, Mr. English. I don't have anything further to add, but I would say that the staff believes that the evidence that we have collected in this investigation does frame the likely scenario. So I would concur with what Mr. English said, and Dr. Civilian, if you would like to add any details to that, please do so.
There's nothing to add here, but I do agree that it should read as likely based on the objective evidence that we collected throughout numerous interviews with Island Express helicopters.
Okay, thank you. Member Chapman, would you like to perhaps have the final word on this? Not necessarily the final word, but what are your thoughts?
I do have a question in terms of how this finding is structured. I'm somewhat confused by the discussion just now in terms of the word likely. Is likely intended to modify only self-induced pressure, or does it modify all that follows? Likely self-induced pressure, likely lack of an alternative plan, likely plan continuation basis, because I think it's clear he didn't have an alternative plan. I would argue